G'day, my name's Dave Fuller. I'm the president of the Melbourne chapter of God Squad CMC. I'm also an Anglican vicar or minister, priest, here in the inner western suburbs of Melbourne. And the recording today is from the front of my church. And you can see part of the cross in the background behind me. You can also see a piece of indigenous art that was painted by Safina Stewart, an indigenous Christian woman based here in Melbourne. Well, friends, my task today is to continue our series on Mark and to take on verses 18 to 22 in chapter 2. We already know that through prior readings that the sort of people that Jesus is attracting, the outcast, the poor, the sinner, the blind, the lame. One particular translation of the Gospel says that the common people received him gladly. But there was another group of people who Jesus was beginning to attract. This young Jewish upstart from up there in Galilee was beginning to get the attention of the religious leadership of the day. And some of the locals, and then later we will read that some of the senior figures from down in Jerusalem came up to check him out. And they're a little bit unimpressed, actually. And we begin to see this process of critiquing going on. And in this particular reading, we see the third occasion of that critique. So let me take you to this particular reading, first verses 18 through to 19. Now, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, "How is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not?" Well, John the Baptist, in his particularly significant public ministry, had gathered around him quite a significant group of followers and disciples. And they practiced a fairly rigorous form of Judaism, which included fasting. There was another very, very committed group of Jewish believers in Jesus' day, known as the Pharisees. Very committed to the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, and committed to living it out. They too fasted twice a week. It's very, very interesting that according to the Old Testament, fasting was required by all Jews on the Day of Atonement, Leviticus 16:29. But as I said earlier, the Pharisees fasted on Mondays and Thursdays throughout the year. They were a very committed group, as were John's disciples. But the question of fasting began to reveal a growing gap between what the Jewish leadership of the day expected in their Messiah and the new priorities that Jesus has begun to exhibit. Some people came to Jesus and asked, "How is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not?" And Jesus gives a twofold response in verses 19 to 20 and then 21 to 22. He first uses the metaphor of a wedding, a common feature of Jewish life. And so the question is, how can the guests, so Jesus comes back and says, how can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and on that day they will fast. Well, friends, a time of a wedding is one of celebration. It's a time for eating and for drinking, not a time for fasting. And in fact, fasting, particularly in the Old Testament, was a sign of mourning. It was a time of penitence for sins. It was a time of abasement of spirit. Jesus' presence with his disciples was a time for joy. It's a time for celebration. Eventually, like John's disciples who had witnessed the execution of their beloved leader that sent them into great mourning. Jesus knows too well that his disciples will one day fast as well in mourning and grief when he is executed as well. And then secondly, Jesus responds further to this question with another metaphor. He says this: "No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins." On this occasion, Jesus uses the metaphor of a garment and the need to pour new wine into new wineskin as common metaphors again of the time. Jesus' messiahship would be a radical departure from a legalistic religious system with its ceremonial focus and practices. A new spirit must find new forms of expression. And while Jesus and his followers were initially seen as a new movement within Judaism, by the time of the book of Acts, the Jesus movement had been expelled from Orthodox Judaism. And by Acts chapter 11, the disciples were first known as Christians. I recall our founder and main founding figure, the Reverend Dr. John Smith, saying to me once that Christian faith had two equal and opposite problems that it often went down, and both were actually wrong. The first predisposition, he said, was that Christian faith had a tendency with some towards legalism. The other, he said, was a tendency towards antinomianism. Antinomianism is a bit of a free-for-all, do your own thing sort of faith and practice. And Smithy said that both were wrong and needed to be put right. Jesus, on the whole, was dealing with legalism. The followers of John and certainly the Pharisees were no antinomianisms. They were strict legalists. They were strict followers of their orthodox faith. God Squad Christian Motorcycle Club, when it was first founded here in Australia in the early 1970s, was a creative expression of faith and mission. It was an exciting new approach that drew many to it and continues to draw people to it even to this day, not just here in Australia, but all over the world. It was an exciting new approach, but God Squad, when it started, was not without its critics, particularly in the church. They didn't like the long hair. They didn't like the tattoos, the casual clothing, the motorbikes, and in particular, who members of God Squad were beginning to hang out with. We have had our fair share of critics about that over the years, and they're probably still out there even at this time. But I think Jesus teaches us through this passage from Mark today that the new wine of the gospel needs new wineskins to express itself in human culture. And God Squad is and continues to be one of those expressions. Amen.